Hello Raptors fans and welcome to Raptors Report. Today we're going to be looking at the Raptors free agency plans, who they should look at, how much they should offer, and all of the fun team building things that pique NBA fans' interests every summer. The Raptors want to avoid the roster construction mistakes that haunted them this past season, so making the correct decisions in free agency will be very important. Without further ado, let's dive in and take a look. First, let's address the elephant in the room. The draft. The NBA draft lottery will happen on June 22nd. There's a great Raptors Report draft episode with pro scout Henry Ward, so if you're interested in draft discussion, watch that episode. Henry has a lot of good insight on that topic. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the team building process is fluid, and free agency is downstream from the draft, meaning that if the Raptors luck into a top 2 pick, their priorities on who to sign will likely be different than if they're picking 7th or 8th. So with that out of the way, there are a couple of things that the Toronto Raptors need to be cognizant of heading into free agency. Number 1, the amount of money they will have available. Number 2, the positions and skills they need to address. And number 3, the players who will be available to sign. So let's look at how much cap space the Raptors will have available. First, we start with their dead cap space, i.e. if they released every single player on the roster outside of the players that have a guaranteed contract next season. The players with guaranteed contracts next season are OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, Fred VanVleet, and Malachi Flynn. The projected max cap space next season is $112 million. The players I named are being paid around $70 million in total, and doing some easy math, that would leave the Raptors with $42 million in cap space. But obviously, $42 million is a bit more than they're actually going to have in reality. In the NBA, teams are allowed to go over the cap to re-sign their own players. But, in order to prevent any funny business, the NBA forces teams to re-sign their own free agents first using a system called cap holds. The way that it works is that players have what I will call ghost salaries that count against the cap until they sign a new contract, or the team that they were last on relinquishes their rights. Relinquishing their rights means that you can no longer go over the cap to sign that player and must use your available cap space. This stops teams from going out and offering huge contracts to players not on their team, and then going over the cap to re-sign their own free agents afterwards. The Raptors have about $85 million worth of cap holds and players with unguaranteed contracts on the books for this offseason, meaning that they'll have to decide who they want to keep and who they don't prior to being able to go out and sign any new free agents. Another thing not taken into account in the $42 million figure is the rookie scale contract from the player they will draft this season. I very much expect that rookie to be on the team next season, so the salary will have to be added to the docket. If the Raptors manage to move up and get a top 4 pick, that player will be paid $6 to $8.3 million next season. If they pick 7th or 8th, the two most likely scenarios, they will pay that player around $4 to $4.5 million. This means that when you factor in how much they will be paying their rookie next season, the Raptors will be up to $74 to $78 million in committed salary, leaving them with approximately $33 to $37 million in cap space. Add on top of that renouncing every single non-guaranteed free agent on the roster is highly unlikely. Firstly, I think that Chris Boucher will be retained at $7 million. Boucher is highly productive, especially when his contract is taken into account, so it really makes no sense for the Raptors to let him walk. Retaining Chris Boucher would leave the Toronto Raptors with $26 to $30 million in cap space. I also expect Yuta Watanabe and Jalen Harris to be back. Watanabe looks like a prototypical 3-and-D forward that every team loves to have, and Jalen Harris impressed as a scoring guard that could play off the bench. They're also being paid a pittance in terms of NBA salary, with the two of them making around $1.5 million each. Retaining both Yuta Watanabe and Jalen Harris would drop the Raptors to around $23 to $27 million in available cap space. After that, the Raptors start to have some tougher decisions to make. The first is what to do with Trent Jr. Trent Jr. had a kind of up and down tenure with the Raptors. I liked the trade initially, and he certainly has potential, but his defense with the Raptors was questionable, and his shot selection left something to be desired. Gary Trent Jr. apparently turned down a $50 million over 3-year deal from Portland, which is why Portland decided to trade him for Norman Powell. As a restricted free agent, the Raptors will have the opportunity to match any contract offered to him. Due to the sunk cost fallacy, I don't think the Raptors should be factoring the Powell trade into anything. Yes, the Raptors traded the very productive fan favorite Norm Powell for Trent Jr., and through that lens, letting Trent walk in the offseason would mean that the Raptors got no value for Powell. But the Raptors should only be evaluating potential deals based on what is best for their future. If letting Gary Trent Jr. walk means that you lost the Powell trade, but it's the best decision moving forward, you just have to accept that you lost the trade and deal with it. Imagine if Gary Trent Jr. were on another roster. Would you be comfortable paying him $20+ million a season? I'm not so sure if I would. $20 million is in the range where players start to become difficult to move and restrict roster flexibility. Anywhere north of $20 million would be a contract based almost entirely on future potential rather than current production. I would be more comfortable at the $15 million mark. The way that restricted free agency works is that another team can sign Trent Jr. to what is known as an offer sheet. An offer sheet is a proposed contract that the Raptors can look at and decide whether to match or not. If they match the offer sheet, Gary Trent Jr. will sign with the Raptors for that amount and length. And if they don't, Trent Jr. will sign with the team that made the offer sheet. Because of this, the Raptors can test the waters, and if another team blows the Raptors out of the water with a deal worth $21, $22, $23 million a season, I think that they should spend their money elsewhere. If there's a more modest bid at $16, $17, $18 million a season, I think that the Raptors should consider matching. If the Raptors signed Gary Trent Jr. to a $15 to $20 million contract, they would only have between $3 and $12 million in available cap space. At this point, the difference between their available cap space and the MLE, which is just under $10 million, is virtually non-existent. So if the Raptors plan on signing Gary Trent Jr., they might as well just abandon trying to stay under the cap. At this point, the best course of action would be to re-sign or sign and trade Lowry and then bring back the useful players on their own team. Re-signing or sign and trading Lowry would result in the same amount of money being added to the Raptors' books. So for all intents and purposes, they're the same when figuring out the cap. I know this is very dense and a little confusing, so let me boil it down into simple terms for you. There are two scenarios that I foresee will be the most likely for the Raptors this free agency. Number one, they sign Gary Trent Jr. and make a move with Lowry, either retaining him or trading him. Or number two, they sign neither Lowry or Gary Trent Jr. and decide to go into free agency with roughly $23 to $27 million available to spend on free agents. Scenario 2 is probably the most interesting to discuss because it involves looking at the pool of free agents outside of the Raptors organization, and the Raptors would have the most cash to play with, in this case $23 to $27 million a season. This amount of money could actually land a good core player, so let me cut to the chase and talk about the guys I think the Raptors should take a look at in this scenario. Number 1 is Lonzo Ball. Lonzo Ball is a very intriguing player, and in my opinion, a great fit for this Raptors roster. Lonzo entered the league with a lot of hype, which quickly cooled off to the point where I think that he's now a bit of an undervalued commodity. He has great size for the point guard position at 6'5", he's a fantastic passer, a good defender, and has developed a reliable three-point shot. In terms of backcourt fit with Fred VanVleet, I think the pairing would be very good. Lonzo's height would allow him to check the larger guard while Fred matches up against the smaller one, making a formidable defensive pair. On offense, Lonzo would provide spacing and give the Raptors another ball handler to allow Fred to play more at the off-guard position, which I think is his ideal spot. Adding a high-level passer like Lonzo Ball would give the Raptors a very interesting dynamic offense. Lonzo's age, 23, would fit perfectly with the Raptors' three other core players in VanVleet, Siakam, and Anunoby. On the downside, Lonzo would not provide the scoring punch the Raptors might be looking for at the guard spot. Lonzo's a restricted free agent, meaning that the Raptors would have to throw a lot of money at him in order to pry him away from the Pelicans. An offer sheet somewhere slightly north of $20 million might be enough that the Pelicans look in a different direction. It also could be risky, because in order to offer this, the Raptors would have to renounce most of their cap holds, and the Pelicans could match, so having a plan B would be prudent. The next option, in my opinion, is Spencer Dinwiddie. Spencer Dinwiddie is a very Raptors-esque player. Selected in the second round, Dinwiddie had to work to earn minutes, and with the rebuilding Brooklyn Nets, he was able to get a lot of reps and slowly but surely established himself as an impressive two-way guard. Last season, prior to his injury, Dinwiddie was having a career year, scoring 20 points per game and averaging almost 7 assists. Dinwiddie, like Lonzo Ball, is a big guard, standing at 6'5", but he's a different type of player. Dinwiddie is much more of a scoring guard than Lonzo, and like Lonzo, he's a good defensive fit with Fred VanVleet in the backcourt, being able to match up against the bigger guard. If the Raptors are concerned about their ability to score from the guard spot, Dinwiddie, if he returns to form, would fill this need. I like the fit a lot, but there are certainly question marks. At the beginning of this season, Dinwiddie suffered a partial ACL tear in his right knee. On the positive side, Dinwiddie's game has never been predicated on athleticism, but it's still a concern. A torn ACL is also not a career death sentence anymore, with players like Zach LaVine bouncing back and returning to form. It's also reportedly a partial tear, which is not as serious as a full tear. Still, any type of knee injury needs to be weighed in when evaluating a potential long-term contract. I would be a fan of a Spencer Dinwiddie signing, and I think a contract in the vicinity of $18 million a season would be able to get it done, perhaps with a team option on a third year as insurance against the knee being an issue. The next person I'd be interested in is Richaun Holmes. I'm almost sounding like a broken record at this point, but the Raptors were extremely limited by their lack of a true big man this past season. Richaun Holmes is an up-and-coming big that appears to be on the cusp of a breakout in Sacramento. His advanced stats are great, he's one of the best finishers in the league, and he's a drop coverage big that would give the Raptors a presence in the paint on defense. Holmes would add rim pressure on offense, being a threat rolling to the rim, grabbing offensive boards for putbacks, being a lob target, and setting strong screens. On defense, having a good drop coverage big man stops easy layups, grabs defensive boards, and removes the need for excessive helping in the paint, leading to open shots on the perimeter, which was something that tortured the Raptors all season long. I'm kind of just describing stereotypical big man things, but that is kind of what Holmes projects to do. Think Clint Capella, Jonas Valanciunas, Jakob Poeltl, etc. If the Raptors want an upgrade at the center spot, Holmes would be a good target to throw money at. I think there's a limit on what you should spend at the center position, and the going rate appears to be $15 million a season, which is around what both Valanciunas and Clint Capella are getting. I'd be a fan of that kind of move. There are some other players that I could see the Raptors going after in scenario 1, where they have $23 to $27 million to spend, but those are my top 3 if the Raptors actually do have some money. The other types of players that the Raptors should be looking at are MLE type free agents. If the Raptors choose to re-sign their own players and enter free agency over the cap, they will have what's called the standard MLE, which is $10 million per season for up to 4 years. If they enter free agency under the cap with the intent to use their cap space to sign free agents, like I explained in the last section, they'll have what's called the room MLE, which is a 2-year contract worth about $5 million per season. In this next section, I'll be examining players that the Raptors could look at using both of these deals. Here are some ideas for players that I might be happy to see signed on the MLE. The first is Evan Fournier. The market is pretty low on Evan Fournier at the moment. He was traded to the Celtics for just 2 second-round picks at the deadline, and he had a decent offensive postseason with 15 points per game on good percentages. Fournier is a strong shooter, a good passer, and a mediocre but not terrible defender. I think that Fournier could be plugged into the Raptors offense very easily and provide spacing and additional playmaking at the guard spot. Fournier is a pro that I think would be a good value signing for the MLE. The next player I thought of was Kelly Olynyk. Kelly Olynyk had a fantastic second half of this past season on the Houston Rockets. On Houston, he had career highs in points, assists, and rebounds, and legitimately looked like an all-star caliber player. After the departure of Harden, the Rockets were extremely talent-starved and needed someone to step up, which Olynyk certainly did. The problem is his defense. Olynyk is not a rim protector, and while he's okay in space, the center position is where he makes the most sense on offense, which means that he'll be tasked with defending the rim defensively, something he's not great at. On the flip side, Olynyk does so many positive things on offense: passing, shooting, scoring in the paint, pick and pop, pick and roll, dribble handoff actions, etc. At the MLE, a lot of the problems with Olynyk are mitigated. The Raptors could re-sign Khem Birch as their defensive big, and then run a three-man big rotation of Birch, Olynyk, and Chris Boucher, which I think works pretty well. I would welcome Kelly if the Raptors choose to sign him with the MLE. The next person the Raptors should look at for the MLE is Malik Monk. This season, Malik Monk mysteriously started to have his minutes cut on the Charlotte Hornets, despite being a productive young player. Monk is just 23 years old and has a sweet-looking shot, good playmaking instincts, and an all-around intriguing offensive package that I think would fit well on the Raptors. Monk's defense is a work in progress, but I think at the MLE he could be a worthwhile gamble due to his nascent offensive skills. Monk is a restricted free agent, but with his role on the Hornets being limited this season, perhaps they don't have him figured into their long-term plans, and maybe the Raptors could acquire him at this price. Perhaps Monk could be a good backup plan if they decide not to retain Gary Trent Jr. The next player is someone who I think the Raptors should go after with the Room MLE, which is the contract that teams get when they go under the cap, like in Scenario 2 where they pursue bigger free agents like Lonzo Ball and Spencer Dinwiddie. The Room MLE is $5 million per season over 2 years. The player I think they should go after is Isaiah Hartenstein. Isaiah Hartenstein is a player that's flown under most people's radars, but the guy is insanely productive and just plain looks like an NBA center. Hartenstein is a legit 7-footer with good instincts, a great motor, and fast feet. He's 23 years of age, and defensively he projects to be a very strong paint protector. The Cavs are likely going to give Jared Allen a big contract in free agency, and Hartenstein would probably be considered positional duplication. The combination of his size, physicality, and seemingly good understanding of where to be and what to do, I think Hartenstein would be a good bet to make. Those are some of the thoughts on guys that I would be interested in at the MLE. The last section will be a quick rundown of the Raptors' own free agents and players with unguaranteed contracts that I haven't mentioned yet, as they are the players that are most likely to be on the roster next season. Firstly, Aaron Baines and Rodney Hood are unlikely to have the final years of their contracts picked up, meaning the Raptors will have the $18-ish million worth of contracts come off their books. The other free agents and unguaranteed players, including Khem Birch, DeAndre Bembry, Freddie Gillespie, Stanley Johnson, and Paul Watson, I would not mind seeing back on the roster next season, but could also see them being released. Bembry, Gillespie, and Watson are all minimum contract players, meaning that they're not too expensive to keep around, and provide some skills, potential, and locker room continuity that could benefit the Raptors. Khem Birch and Stanley Johnson are free agents, meaning the Raptors would have to offer them contracts. I would not mind seeing Khem Birch retained at a contract somewhere around $5 to $7 million, as he proved to be a capable big man. As for Stanley Johnson, I'm higher on him than most Raptors fans. He's only 25, and if the Raptors could re-sign him for the minimum, I would like that deal. And that brings us to the end of the Raptors' own free agents, and with that, we are finished with the episode. The Raptors will have a lot of things to think about after the draft, and I hope that I was able to provide a bit of context for fans who wanted more details on what the Raptors might do this summer. Are there any names that I left out that you think could help the Raptors? Is there anyone I did mention that you think I shouldn't have? Let me know in the comments section or on Twitter at Raptors Report. please remember to like and subscribe, as that helps the channel grow. And as always, thanks for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.